To Renee Good's death, Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey and Representative Ayanna Pressley are now leading the charge to abolish qualified immunity for federal law enforcement. Today, they announced an update to the Ending Qualified Immunity Act, which they both first introduced 5 years ago after George Floyd was murdered by a Minneapolis police officer. This 2026 version of the bill would allow victims to sue federal authorities, not just state and local officials, for civil rights violations. It would also eliminate the defense of qualified immunity in these lawsuits. Now, in announcing the revision of the bill, Senator Markey stated, "When masked ICE agents are allowed to kill and harm people with impunity, we have crossed a dangerous threshold in our nation."